Okay, Jesse, I'm going to hand it off to you. It looks like we have our full panel here and we're excited to get started.
Awesome. Yeah, Lori, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining. I'm really looking forward to this session together. We have an incredible lineup of speakers and we have a very important panel topic. And I think just to quickly frame the discussion before we dive into our speakers' presentations, I think the themes here: social cohesion, urban-rural dynamics, mobility, resilience, climate change, they're just really on the forefront of many of our minds. I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but we have more people on the move than ever before, more people displaced from their homes than at any time in modern history. And conflict is on the rise, and those conflicts are lasting longer. So it just sort of drives home why thinking about these issues is so crucial for us. And yeah, we also know that people get by in their lives largely on their own and through their relationships, their social ties, how they've created a social fabric around them that helps them to cope and thrive and solve problems, work across groups, within groups, and that's really steering folks' life outcomes, their futures, and what they're hoping for. So I'm excited about this set of presentations we have. They really touch on, different pieces to this puzzle, and I think we're going to have a very rich conversation together. And with that, I am going to get out of the way and introduce our speakers. And Lori, who opened up at the top of the event, Lori and I are co-facilitating this, so you're going to hear from both of us throughout this session. And I'm realizing I forgot to introduce myself. So I am Jessie Anderson, a Senior Conflict Advisor at the Center for Resilience at USAID. And I have the pleasure to start to introduce our panelists. So first we have Katya Stark-Card, a governance researcher at the Airbell Impact Lab. Katya leads IRC's research on peacebuilding, governance, and urbanization. She will draw on IRC's research conducted in 2021 in Bukavu, DRC, and Maiduguri, funded by the U.S. Institute of Peace, which explored how displacement affects urban areas and the promising approaches to enhance resilience and mitigate risk of violent conflict. So Katya, thank you for joining us. And we'll move through all the bios, just so folks know. So next we have Imrana Buba. Imrana is a PhD researcher at the Department of Political Science at the University of Oslo. His research is on the dynamics of political violence, social resilience, and peace in northern Nigeria. And I will now turn over to Lori for the next two bios.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jesse. I'll jump in here and proceed with the introductions. But yes, quickly, I'm Lori Ashley. I am a climate adaptation advisor at USAID, where I sit with Jesse in our Center for Resilience. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today and to have the chance to work with this really excellent panel. I will now introduce Edmore Malupeka. He's a governance coordinator in South Sudan with the International Rescue Committee, and he has led the US-funded Communities Managing Conflict, CMC project, which uses a people-to-people approach to working with communities affected by conflict. He's going to share the project's lessons learned in strengthening social cohesion and findings from IRC's research on generational differences and attitudes toward conflict in that program area. So welcome, Edmore. And finally, we have Dr. Ahim Wenman, who is an expert on the economic perspectives of violent conflict, peace mediation, and peace building, and has years of experience in conflict response, peace processes, conflict prevention, and violence reduction. Thank you all for joining. Really, I think we're joining you more than you joining us. It's wonderful to be here with this great group. With that, Katya, why don't I turn it over to you to kick us off, and then Jesse can sort of hand over the baton between our panelists. And just a flag for everyone on the line, we really welcome your participation in the discussion. We will have a chance to have a discussion after our series of panelists, so please don't hesitate, and we encourage you to drop questions or comments into the chat. That will really help us have that conversation amongst the group in a few minutes. So please go ahead and do that if things come to mind. Over to you, Katya.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jessie and Lori, for this introductions, and thank you all for joining the panel and this call. So I know you're not supposed to, but I do have slides, and I will share those for the more visually inclined in the room, such as myself, who cannot follow anything with the visual props. So let me start sharing my screen, and I hope nobody opposes. Here we go. All right. Can someone confirm you're able to see?
I can see it.
All right.
Katya, we see you well, but if you go into presentation mode, it might make it a little, yep, that's perfect.
Thank you so much. Okay, and I'll try to stay on time. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I will present some findings from our recent study, which was conducted in Bukavu in DRC and Maiduguri in Nigeria, which looked at cities as destination areas of conflict and climate migration. So the study was generously funded by USIP and was conducted by us, the IRC, with the help of local researchers. So the rationale for this study was, as Jessie mentioned, there are more people that are displaced today by conflict and natural disaster than ever before. Climate change is recognized as a contributing factor both in migration and conflict. Now, what's perhaps less known is that when people flee, it's usually not across borders, right? But they flee to the closest urban areas, the closest city. And those are often, or usually actually, smaller intermediary cities. And this migration to cities increases pressure on natural resources, right, in those cities, specifically land and water. We'll be talking about land and water. And then this pressure, in turn, can exacerbate vulnerabilities and exclusions and increase the risk of conflict, including violent conflict, especially when these tensions are politicized by local actors. But what we also know is that so far, like studies that focused on conflict around climate change have mostly focused on the rural settings, right? And less so on cities. So what we wanted to do was to shift the attention from sending areas, so rural areas, to destination areas, which are urban areas, and specifically to look at the smaller cities, right? Not capitals. So by smaller, we mean like district capitals, regional capitals, right? And it's these cities that are most affected, but can also be less prepared and less equipped to manage displacement and all the consequences of displacement. And the questions that guided this study were, okay, so how does forced displacement into urban areas affect access to and competition over natural resources? So meaning land and water, right? What are the factors that worsen or reduce the risk of violent conflict over natural resources? And what formal or informal governance structures and processes exist or perhaps emerge in these areas to manage natural resources and conflict around them? As well as what are some of the promising approaches that exist or have been developed in these areas that enhance resilience and mitigate the risk to violent conflict. So, as mentioned, this research was conducted in two cities, in Maiduguri, Nigeria, and Bukavu in DRC, and it was conducted in two neighborhoods in each. So I will not go into detail, but I will jump now straight into the main findings. And we summarized our main findings into three areas, let's say. And these are findings that are consistent across both contexts, okay? So both cities, so not specific to the cities, but things that we observed in both contexts, right? So the first thing is that, as can be expected, displacement into urban areas, so displacement that can be caused by conflict or climate or both, obviously decreases the accessibility and affordability of land and water, but this in itself does not necessarily lead to violent conflict, okay? So we've seen the displacement in both contexts. Bukavu and Maiduguri has put significant strain on resources. So land and housing have become more scarce, more unaffordable, and people now tend to settle in disaster-prone areas even more than before. water is in short supply, is expensive, and it's unsafe, and it's not accessible. And also waterborne diseases are common because of inappropriate waste management and sanitation. So even though tensions were reported around natural resources in both cities, there was no violent identity-based intergroup conflict between displaced and host communities that was reported in these researched areas. And this is a really important point because, based on literature reviews, there were many factors that were present in this context that could have led to conflict, intergroup conflict between host and displaced communities, but we did not observe it in our research. Instead, what seems to be more important is that urban governance and planning, rather than displacement and migration themselves, might have a larger effect on exacerbating vulnerabilities and the risk of violent conflict. Okay, so it was clear that both migrants, recent migrants, and long-time residents were affected by outdated urban planning that has not kept pace with urbanization and was inadequate for managing urban growth. We saw that people are also affected by limited representation and lack of accountable leadership, both at the city and at the neighborhood level. And this was especially the case for minorities and the displaced. An interesting point, which perhaps I can elaborate a bit more during the Q&A part, is that the nature of displacement might generate different expectations of communities from the authorities, but let's return to this later. And what was also observed in both contexts, and perhaps was more salient than tensions between, between groups in the community, it was the divide, the reported and observed divide between the government authorities and the communities, right? And specifically, people had concerns and complaints about government actions and their practices. For example, in Maiduguri, when we're conducting our research around that time, there was a displacement campaign that was announced, right? That was to be conducted by the government in flood-prone areas. A demolition campaign, sorry. And this was not conducted in any sort of, there was no consultation with affected communities. They were not involved in decision-making. And this created a lot of tensions between the communities and the local authorities, including, violent confrontations between those two. And if we continue, right, on this main finding is that, so in addition to this direct government action, what we also noted is that in general, non-transparent practices, and this can include exploitative, speculative, arbitrary, and other preferential practices in the management of urban resources and the city and at the neighborhood community level may cause situations that can lead to interpersonal violence. For example, in Bukavu, killings were reported around the selling of land or unclear borders of land plots, right? We also noticed that women and children in these underserved urban areas are particularly vulnerable and are disproportionately bearing the cost of water scarcity and limited infrastructure and they experience everyday insecurities. For example, when they go fetch water, it's insecure. They might be victims of sexual attacks. There's a lot of conflict around water points that the children are affected by. And so it was also clear that NGOs and private sector actors, they do fill the gap, right? But there's often limited coordination with city governments. And this, then coupled with the lack of enforcement of government regulation and lack of quality control, results in suboptimal and unsustainable outcomes. And then finally, the third finding, which I think is also really, really important, for future action, is that community level structures in urban areas, much like in rural areas, are key to managing conflict and play a role, obviously, in access to natural resources, particularly around water. But sometimes they're not as inclusive as they could be, and this limits their effectiveness, right? So what we saw again in both contexts, both in Maiduguri and Bukavu, is that conflict is largely mitigated and managed at the community level, and especially by trusted community leaders, trusted local leaders. And the stress here really is on trusted ones, both formal and informal. It's also managed by informal governance structures, community-based organizations, and elders. All of these play a key role in managing conflict in urban and peri-urban areas. And what we noticed in both contexts is that they are effective because there is a vertical structure that they are part of, right? So for example, in Maiduguri, traditional authorities at the community level, they're part of like a vertical structure of traditional authorities that is then replicated at the ward level and so on. Also, community-based organizations and individuals proactively engage themselves to address the needs in their communities. And sometimes mechanisms between neighbors are devised to facilitate access to water. For example, in Maiduguri, local youth organizations would step in to negotiate with water vendors. Or for example, in Bukavu, the people who have access to piped water in the community would share that either for free or for a fee with their neighbors and so on. And just to conclude this, but there are also some limitations, of community level governance and resource management structures, because they might not be sufficiently responsive to the needs of women and minorities, and they're not always representative of all residents. And it's great that individuals take initiative and lead, but like these initiatives sometimes have limited reliability, right, when it comes to accessing resources. So I think I have exhausted my time, so I will stop here, and I'm very happy to then continue the discussion during our Q&A session.
Katya, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for so nicely synthesizing so much information in a very short period of time. Yeah, I thought that was exceptional. I'm actually personally still jet lagged from returning from a trip to Nigeria, where the programming we're focused on is in the Northeast. So I just, yeah, especially found that very valuable. Thank you. And I will now move us on to our next speaker, Imrana Buba. Imrana, thank you so much for joining us as well. And over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, I don't have slides like Katya, so mine maybe may not be as interesting. My research in northwestern Nigeria focus on understanding how the conflict dynamics change, especially when it is caused by civilian agency, civilian actions, changing the dynamics of conflict. And unlike in northeastern Nigeria, where Boko Haram rebels fight Nigerian government, in northwestern Nigeria is a kind of different armed actors, which media refer to as bandit. But this bandit actually started as ethnic militias. So I look at how the conflict started and how it changed over time to become organized crime. So for context, northwestern Nigeria is largely dominated by Hausa and Fulani, which is the dominant ethnic groups in northern Nigeria. And unlike most communal conflict in Nigeria, where the divide is between Muslim and Christians in central Nigeria, or sometimes between southern Christians and northern Muslims, in northwest, 98 to 99% of the population are Muslim. So the main driver of the conflict is ethnic identity, not religion. And one of the main triggers was occupation of grazing reserve. So normally in rural areas, government has these reserve areas for grazing, and this has history since from the colonial period. But because politicians want to reward their loyalists, a kind of also because land is very limited due to climate change, a lot of things, so they start to give out those lands. At that time when they were given the lands, most of the pastoralists were not there because they normally move different season. So during rainy period, they move to different part, and during dry season, they move back to where they can have access to water. So this main trigger was that allocation of land. And when farmers have already occupied the land for a few months, and then pastoralists coming, it caused conflict. And because they have this ethnic divide, most Fulanis are pastoralists and most farmers are Hausas, it starts to take ethnic dimension. And most of the Fulani pastoralists that actually encroach the new farmland of houses are not even resident. They are not locals, people that stay in the villages. They are mostly people that come from the different part of the country. And to some extent, some of them are also from northeastern Nigeria because Boko Haram insurgency also affected the area, so they have to move to the northwestern part. But because of issues of governance also in Nigeria, with the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast, in the southwest, there is a secessionist group also, IPOP. There is this limited state capacity, especially to deploy security forces. So most communities start to form their militia to fight the opposing ethnic groups. Hausas form Ensakai, Mbanga, and then Fulani also form their own groups, which they call Mbindiga. And initially, the targeting is mostly to groups that they target groups that attack maybe the opposing ethnic groups. But over time, it evolved like to even attack other innocent people in other villages because they assume like they are like co-ethnics. Since Hausas attack us, we can attack any Hausa people. And because also there is that lack of governance, so communities have to find solutions. So some communities that resort to this armed self-defense, they fight, but then there are some that decide to form peace committees to engage in a kind of non-violent approach. And one way that they tried to resolve was to start to pay them protection payment. So instead of like to attack, they can say, okay, we can give you this money. Initially, the payment was a kind of compensation for encroachment of the land. But over time, it started to become a kind of fixed payment. Like, so if you don't want us to attack you have to keep giving us this money. And this money is in millions of naira. A small community, sometimes they have to pay 10 million, they have to pay 20 million to the Fulani militia. So this payment changed the whole attack. Initially from this communal violence, it became a kind of organized crime because they understand that idea of demanding money. If you don't want us to attack, attack you, please give us money. So over time, they just become organized crime. And not only attacking Hausa communities, they start to attack both Hausa and Fulani communities. As at when I conducted my field research in 2020, my first field research, they have grown to over 100 gangs. And they start to even compete with each other. So they abandon their original mission of fighting Hausas to just become organized criminal gangs. And from that idea of even farming, because they have attacked many communities, people no longer even stay in the villages. So that caused a lot of also shift. People have to leave all their rural areas to also move to other part of the country. And that what also caused tension in other communities. So many Hausas and Fulanis that live their villages, they moved to southern Nigeria, and that caused a lot of tension because to them, they are also causing a lot of issues. So one thing overall, one of the key conclusion I drew from my research, one thing, there is issue of climate change, which is clear like from all the data, but the second thing is about governance, like a lot of frustration. People mention they have councillors, they have local chairmen, but they never see them in the rural village, in the rural areas. And then issues of state security also. When they call police, even when the militias demand for the protection payment, they no longer come. So some of them that stay in the villages to continue paying the militias, they just don't have option. But paying the militias is also very dangerous because the more they pay them, because the more they become stronger. They have acquired more weapons and they become a kind of more like more strong, and they become a kind of more dangerous. So these are some of the dynamics that I look at how it affects like conflict in the region. Thank you.
And Rana, thank you. Thank you so much for those remarks. Again, everyone is doing an incredible job keeping to time, but also giving us such rich insights on your work. So thank you for that. And now I will turn to Ed Moore. to bring us to South Sudan and to be sharing more about his work there. So Edmore, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so my name is Edmore, like it has been alluded to. Yes, I'm a peacebuilding practitioner, as it were, working for IRC in South Sudan. Of course, I've worked for IRC for quite a long, 13 years now. And the one interesting thing about Edmore is that for the past 13 years, 13 years, I've been implementing USAID CMM projects, DRR, and so forth. So I've worked a lot of extensive experience, really, working with conflict-affected areas. So I think I've shared my...
Edmore, I'm so sorry. This is Lori. I'm just going to jump in and say, if possible, could you put the slide in presenting mode, and that would allow us to see it just a bit better.
Okay, thank you.
If not, don't worry, it's fine. And my apologies for interrupting.
I hope it's okay now.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Yes, yeah. So yes, I'm in South Sudan. We were implementing a 30-month USAID CMM funded program called Community Managing Conflict in South Sudan. I think for all of us, maybe we know the history of South Sudan, that South Sudan, is a country that has a checkered history in terms of conflicts, in terms of the humanitarian crisis, in terms of displacement, and all sorts of problems, protracted crises, as it were. So this project really focused on hotspots in the USAID focal strategic areas in South Sudan. So we implemented this project from September 2020, and the focus of this project was really to reduce the likelihood of violent conflict, working with the local actors, to strengthen their capacity, to inform, conflict mitigation and management, and also trying to strengthen communities in terms of, resolving conflicts as well as mitigating conflicts. So this was a 30-month project, and it's also one of the one of the beauty of this project was that it embedded a research which really looked at the culture of violence. The research question was the culture of violence in terms of is the culture of violence something that is passed down generationally, or have youth developed their own culture of violence? So this was the research question for the research, as it were, and we're trying to look at really trying to understand and also investigate the generational differences on what works to promote attitudinal change for older community members and versus youth. I think, as you also know, a lot of challenges that are happening in South Sudan, they are also attributed to the youth issues, that are said about. So we really wanted to understand the specific needs of each group for targeting messaging, developing tailored activities for increased efficiency, and also scaling project successes and supporting sustainable peace in South Sudan. So the key activities of this of this project, as it were, from a practitioner point of view, number one, we built the capacity of the local authority, local peace actors. Then we also promoted intercommunal cross cross-border, peace building activities, and we were working with also all the actors, or in the two localities where we're working, and we're focusing more on cross borders, where we according to our analysis, we had realized, those were the corridors where, we had a lot of cattle raiding, a lot of, revenge killing, and so forth. Then the other thing about this project was also, like, it was also situated in a context which is also affected by extreme weather, where we have, for the past 4 or 5 years, in these communities, there has been a lot of displacement as a result of not only the conflict, but it became a vicious cycle in terms of the conflict, in terms of the flooding, and so forth. So this is the project that we implemented in that region. Then for this research, what really informed the approach of this research, we use the program data as well as the the research data. In terms of the program data, we focus more on a community peace and development framework, which was an initiative which we came up and we piloted in South Sudan, in order to quantitatively measure indicators that contribute to peace from the perspective of the communities, and also to bring people together through a systematic approach through the CPDF. We also use the most significant change stories, so as to also try to understand some of the unexpected impacts from the project. Then we also conducted the conflict analysis, and one of the key approaches we then used in terms of the research data was a governance diary, where we conducted a series of tailored one-on-one conversations with with the 20 respondents in the 2 areas. So in terms of the wider research that we also looked at as we developed our research question and so forth, we looked at some of the findings. For example, work by Cherry Leighton in South Sudan suggests that youth do not have a separate culture, but we're struggling to fit in between home and Akuma, or the military, or the government structures. And also, the other evidence was that adults always tend to surrender to the needs of the youth, thereby relinquishing their claims to authority. Then the other one was also talking about the livelihood crisis, as the economic crisis and its wide consequences have helped turn people against each other. So this research was embedded in the program. So as we were implementing the project, the program activities in the 2 locations, we're also conducting this research through the methodologies that I have alluded to. Yeah. So yeah. So in terms of the key findings from this research, like I talked about, the history of this country is plagued by conflict, multi-layered, conflicts, extreme weather, a lot of displacement due to conflict, weather, people displaced to not only the urban areas, to IDP camps, people displaced to semi-urban areas which are not even developed at all, and also people are running into towns which are also not really very developed. So some of the key findings really from this research included the following. From the research, it also came out that across the generations, whether youth or communities, they have the same concerns as well as daily conflicts and challenges. So this brings to the fore the idea that when you look from a practitioner's point of view, when you look at a community at times, you don't need to put them in buckets in terms of the challenges that they face. It is the same person who faces the conflict, displacement, the first person who interfaces with the youth with with the guns and so forth. Then the other one was across generations, youth are seen as the main perpetrators of conflicts, particularly in South Sudan, mainly because in terms of gun ownership, firearms, most of the youth they have, the 72%, most of them are in the rural areas, and they have a lot of guns. So there is a general perception that youth are seen as the perpetrators of conflict, and also the issue that the youth themselves are looking at the existing, conflict resolution, strategies or mechanisms in place. They are not happy at all. They are not satisfied. Yeah, they have the guns. They are also not satisfied with the mechanisms for conflict resolution. Yeah, then also from the research, it also came out that across the generations, there is an agreement on the importance of women in peace building and decision making. Yeah, and also, members, they also view the government. When I saw the government, I look at the entire structure of the government as an important actor in promoting. That is their perception, as it were. Yeah. So when we then the research went on to really look at what is it that the people say, this conflict, they affect all of us. These challenges, they affect all of us. So upon being asked about the challenges that they face in terms of the conflicts and so forth, they would talk about hunger, flooding, lack of economic opportunities, lack of access, looting, cattle raiding, which are very common, and also youth with the guns. Then, yeah, and also communities looking at hunger and flooding, for example, as some of the triggers, that push people to the urban areas, POCs, IDPs, communities see a cyclical relationship between these hunger, flooding, and lack of economic opportunities. When you ask them, they become blurred because they see all these things, feeding into the challenges that they, that they face. And in terms of lack of, services and economic opportunities, the communities, they actually feel that because of lack of access to education and health, they are, they are subject. They become very vulnerable. Yeah, I think we also understand that for South Sudan, I think the illiteracy rate is about 70%. So they feel like that lack of access to health and education, these are some of the root causes of the challenges that they face. And also, yeah, they are also failing the local economy and so forth, simply because of the local economic opportunities that are available and so forth. Then also, when we did a deep dive on this research to really look at some of the key issues that normally come out in terms of the discourse around looting, cattle raiding, and youth with guns, it is the feeling of the people that youth with guns, they named them as one of the major sources of conflict among communities. And indeed, in South Sudan, particularly in the conflict zones, sports, youth with the guns have, they have a say. And also the issue of looting. This is also something that they also cite as a major concern across, also citing youth as being and the politicians as being the perpetrators of the above. Then in terms of the actors, really, I think, as there is a conflict. We have, displacement and even migration to towns. They also look at the government and youth as some of the key people or actors who benefit and perpetuate conflict for their own for their own good. Then I've talked about the role of women, as it were, to say, from the research, we have realized that the role that women do have a role in peace building activities and decision making, and in the most significant focus group discussions that we had, we realized some changes in the role of women as a key domain of change. Though we all know that women also from the perception and also evidence available they are the primary victims of conflict in many ways. And when there is a displacement, when there's a conflict, extreme weather, in most cases, they are seen as the primary victims of the conflict. The conflict resolutions, as it were, in the areas, it became evidently clear that most of the participants were satisfied with the current conflict resolution methods. Yeah, but also when we then looked at it closely, these are just the traditional mechanisms of conflict resolution methods, and you know, there's lack of rule of law, no statutory courts, but the communities, when they look at themselves, they feel like the conflict resolutions that are there, mechanisms that are there for them, I think they suffice in terms of resolving conflicts if they are utilized appropriately and well. And one of the key things that we also did in this project was to work with the peace committees and other local, actors. So, the communities also saw a distinct role that the peace committees played in terms of, promoting, conflict resolution. Then, yes, of course, the youth, they are very unhappy with the methods that are available, be they traditional, also they are very, very unhappy with those. Then the other issue that also came, particularly from the respondents, was really to say the disarmament of the youth is something that is topical, because they feel that as long as the firearms are in the hands of the youth and there's no control on the use of the firearms, then there's a problem. Yeah, and of course, other practices that the project really fostered, like community dialogue, and also making sure that there is access to services, economic opportunities, and peace building activities that are grounded on the context. These are some of the things that came out of the research. Yeah. Then I talked about the relationship between youth and traditional leaders. There's a total mistrust. They don't trust each other, and traditional leaders and other community leaders, they are there to lead, but the youth, they have the guns, and as much as they may not be in the decision-making matrix, but these people are supposed to work together. But the situation at the moment is there's a lot of distrust. Also when you also look at some of the displacement that have taken place, they have been pushed mainly politically motivated, but also youth being used as a pawn because of their access to guns and so forth. Yes. Then in terms of the government, the politicians, across generations, there was a recognition that government and politicians are key conflict actors. They are both dividers and connectors. This is very evident, and there's a lot of evidence in terms of what how this has manifested, particularly in the region. Yeah, so they also feel like the government has a control really in terms of how they can disarm the youth, and once that is done, I'm sure some of the conflicts that drive people to move to the urban areas and also to the IDP camps and POCs will be minimized. Yeah. So in terms of the
I just want to chime in super quickly. Everything you have been sharing is so brilliant. I just want to make sure we have time for our last speaker and some good Q&A. Can this be our last slide?
Okay. So in terms of the looking at the sustainability, and particularly looking at domains of change, it is always good, like from a peace building perspective, to work with the local partners, and also to work with the local actors and local partners through localization. And most of from the research, these peace committees that we've been working with, they've been seen as trusted impartial board with communities, but they are political, and we trained in terms of humanitarian principles and so forth. Then of course there have been changes in gender dynamics, collaboration across generations, and also changes in regarding conflict. So lastly, in terms of some of the recommendations in peace building, really that may also help when we look at peace building, social cohesion, and also trying to curb some of the challenges related to climate. It is really the people-to-people approach that USAID really emphasizes on. that we also used in this project really helped because we're working with local actors. You know, like in South Sudan, they've also accepted that as a workable mechanism. They now call it, people-to-people conversation. Everything where they bring people together, they call it people-to-people. So this is something that can be, scaled up. Then, of course, the issue of cross-border. These conflicts, as we look at them, that causes displacement. They know no boundaries. So it is always good to have, fashion activity, programs that also look across the border. Then, of course, the issue of making sure that in programming, it is always good to understand the complexities of the challenges and that people have. And one of the key approaches is to do conflict sensitivity analysis. So conflict sensitivity is very, very important. And we've also realized that most of this involves a lot of displacement, and people are displaced, they become traumatized. So it is always good to have, or to integrate or meaningfully embed, trauma approaches in the approaches that we use. Yeah. Thank you, and over to you.
Awesome, Edmore, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to move quickly on to our final speaker, Dr. Wenman. Dr. Wenman, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, and greetings from Geneva in Switzerland. It's a pleasure to be with PeaceCon today. I myself have founded and co-founded Geneva Peace Week about 10 years ago, so it's a pleasure to speak for the first time at PeaceCon. I'm speaking to you today about a slightly more at the end of this panel that was very ground-based, coming up to kind of more the global level. And I'm speaking from a research endeavor which I led for the USIP that was entitled Activating Pragmatic Peacebuilding for Climate Change Adaptation in Cities. Now, there's a lot in this title, but the two main pointers that come out of this paper is that whoever does climate change adaptation and invests in climate change adaptation requires to take much more to put much more attention to informal power systems. These are really driving the subnational realities in cities, also in rural areas, but the focus was focused in cities. And I think our previous speakers have already unpacked the diversities of these power systems extremely well. The second pointer is about the type of responses that can work in these extremely complex environments, which are prioritizing multidimensional approaches and investments into multidimensional programming rather than in single sector investments. So these are some of the headline pointers which are coming out of this research endeavors, but allow me perhaps to unpack some of the elements of this research in three stages. The first, I'm going to look at some of the overall strategic contexts in which we currently reflect on the peace building and climate change impacts, then to make a comment about the scale of the issue which is in front of us, and then to look at some of the responses, what we can really do by focusing more on approaches like pragmatic peace building. Now, I will not reiterate all of the fantastic substantive work on what are the current multitude of conflict risks. I just point to the research of the IPCC, some of the work, of course, of those who look at conflict risk, but also on the risks of new technologies on societies. One thing that is abundantly clear is that the confluence of so many risk factors do create systemic challenges that are converging into ever more frequent and intense crises in specific localities. And these specific localities will be specifically strongly felt in the places where people live, which is in cities. Now, why focusing on cities and also the kind of the sub-national dimension and also the sub-municipal dimensions of cities becomes clear if we look at some of the scales involved. And I took some pains in just identifying the work on what are we in fact talking about when we are talking about cities. And it's quite alarming when we see how many of them there are. Overall, if we are looking at settlements above 300,000, we're looking at 2,226 urban political entities. And if we are going, of course, to the big ones, we have about 41 cities by 2030 that have more than 10 million inhabitants, with, of course, Kinshasa being the leader of the pack with how many? With over 30 million people projected by 2040. So you have this tremendous diversity, which only becomes real if you think that the current multilateral responses that are ordered around states are in fact around 193 state entities. So if we are looking at the diversity of impact on climate change in cities, one has to include the full diversity of what we're talking about. If we really take the challenge as set out, of course, by the USAID climate change policy to create systemic impact, that we need to take this diversity seriously. But the story becomes more complicated because each of these political entities, these 2,226 entities, can easily be divided into another 5 to 10 informal entities that are really governing the place. Those of you who have been to many cities, you know that there are many parts of the cities where public authorities would never go, but they are still governed. No? In Civil War research, we call this rebel governance. In other research or in the development circles, you call this hybrid political orders. So this hybridity is something that is a reality. And if we conceptualize responses to climate change adaptation from a peacebuilding perspective, we need to start thinking of doing adaptation from the state in which cities find themselves. So in the what is. And the what is the hybrid political order. And this what is not necessarily congruent to a formal political order, a state-based order, or a city government type of order. And that places, of course, several government actors or international organizations at a significant puzzle, because formal actors and states like to cooperate with other states, state agencies like to cooperate with other state agencies, and many formal actors are not very well set up in order to engage and really advance practical climate change adaptation progress in these very high degrees of hybridity, partly because the actors you need to engage with are beyond an acceptable political pedigree, and sometimes it is simply not possible to engage with them for state actors, because some of these actors are either sanctions or they are outlawed or they are named terror organizations, but nevertheless they have a lot of de facto power. Now, it's perhaps important to emphasize that for peace builders, this is daily work. This is what peace builders do. They speak to anyone that is necessary to be spoken to and to be engaged in order to take a specific setting out of a situation of conflict. So for peace builders and those who work on discrete conflict resolution or peace mediation, this is nothing new. But for many individuals and actors who are working on climate change adaptation, who are used to more formal engagements to work on systemic climate or citywide climate change mitigation and adaptation, that is an unusual or a new form of practice. Yet there is an entire competence network out there that, in my view, is ready to be mobilized in order to support climate change adaptation in some of the world's most difficult environments and some of the world's most violent environments that nevertheless need climate change adaptation processes. I'm saying this, of course, working in Geneva, which is a city that has a second-degree relationship to any armed actor anywhere in the world. So it's perhaps also something very Swiss or very Genevan to say, but nevertheless, it's a reality. I think research is only too direct. What happens to formal programming if hybrid political orders are underestimated? I just point to Afghanistan. Nigeria is another very potent example. Or if we're looking at Syria and other conflict zones and recent state-building endeavors, there are many examples that are extremely well covered by academic research. Now, the notion of pragmatic peace building comes exactly out of this reflections of the peace building community, that there needs to be a middle path between the relative normatively based peace building that wants to build prosperity, order, and participation all at once, and the, let's say, less inclusive peace building that is about more of a stable, stability-led type of peace, or a negative peace only. And what this literature from conflict studies and the social sciences, a lot of field research based on this, what they emphasize in pragmatic peace building is that the predominant state-centric norms are insufficient as guides for international actors, and in turn underline the importance of rethinking the mechanism and modalities for the co-creation or co-production of more peaceful cities. And of course, the question about the who holds power and who lives in this place, how can this constituency be involved in this process? They also argue and find that that pragmatic peace building represents a constructive and iterative engagement with what is, in terms of actors that challenge or complement the sovereignty and monopolies of states. So it is very much about what is possible in the shorter term, and it takes a step back from the high ambitions of establishing order, prosperity, and participation all at once. Now, the operational manifestation or the operational recommendation that comes out of now taking a pragmatic peace building into climate change adaptation relies on two pillars, which I will just rely on three pillars, but I will emphasize the first two. The one is, how do you respond to this tremendous complexity at the city level? And here the response is with multidimensional programming. You cannot securitize your way out of climate change adaptation by only emphasizing support to security forces. You need support to emergency services. You need support to community building. Everything that previous speakers have just met, the importance of informal mediators that are trusted. All of these can be supported and funded, as well as social resilience programs among specific constituents such as youth. So why is this a departure? Because for particular many larger development organizations investing in climate change, it is large-scale single sector investments are just so much easier. Whereas multidimensional and of course based on more collective impact type of modalities are fitting much less easier in a log frame of a large-scale development organization. And that is a very subtle way of exploring, of course, how one needs to adapt these type of efforts to all the different dimensions all the different diversities which are which one finds in so many different entities that I've discussed about earlier. So the second point is, rather than thinking about programming and thinking about things that are funded from the outside, the operational response is really to go towards a software that can be applied by whoever can apply it in the different places, so that it is not something that an external donor needs supports, but is something that can be mobilized through the existing resources in the very city that exists. And important on this, like in are platforms that coordinate and manage these resources. So it's like I wouldn't call it an Uberization of climate change mitigation approaches, but there is something in the business literature that underlies the foundations of how platforms work, the private sector platforms that offer a significant opportunity for scaling very localized climate change mitigation approaches. Now, why is this potentially important? Because the systemic relationships are likely to break down between state and many cities. If the predictions of the IPCC are correct, then you have systemic failures of states. And what then usually happens is that systems break down, but they reassemble at a lower level of different functional entities that create a new whole. And that is exactly where the city level comes in. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, the big idea I conclude the paper with is a new push in the service of climate change adaptation to urban political settlements. We know very, very clearly which are the cities that are most at risk for climate change impact. And this is why now is the moment to prepare in these cities to have political settlements between formal actors and informal actors about what to do when the city breaks down. And with these words, I leave you. Thank you very much.
Dr. Wenman, thank you so much. I mean, I think you put it very nicely at the top of your presentation, but I think it was a really fitting final speaker presentation to just really raise some provocative ideas, thinking that makes sense across all of our panelists. And I hope that we carry that into the Q&A with everyone. I did want to flag, so Lori and I will be moderating Q&A for the rest of our time together. We have a bunch of questions for our panelists because all of your presentations and your research and your work is fascinating, but we do want to privilege the audience first. So audience members, if you have any questions, please, we've collected a couple. Please feel free to raise your hand if you would like to engage verbally with the panelists, or feel free to put your question in the chat, and we will kick off just to make sure we get them in with the couple that we've collected so far. And then Lori and I will add on questions as we have time. So the first question, now this one could be quick because I do know there's a question for Imrana that was answered in the chat, but Imrana, I don't know if you want to elaborate on it anymore. The question was, is this extortion protection payment from communities the main source of income for gangs, or do they have other sources of income too? And I'm sure folks would be interested just what some of those other income sources are. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, initially that was their major source, or I can even say that that is the only source. But as they become stronger, they acquire more weapons. They diversify. So with many factions, they start to kidnap people for ransom, and that become like a kind of another source of income. But they still do them together. So they impose the protection payment, which is more of like extortion now, and then when communities do not pay, they engage in also kidnapping for ransom. So they engage in all these kind of things, and that is why they are no longer like engaging in the communal conflict. It just becomes source of income for them. Thank you.
Awesome. Imrana, thank you so much for adding on there. And we have another question. Our next question is for Eddie. Eddie, can you explain how the government in South Sudan is seen as benefiting from the conflict? And do people differentiate between local and national level government actors in this regard? And I'm sure this could be a master class on its own. But yeah, any insights you have for, I believe this was Katya's question, would be wonderful. So over to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so I think in most cases, when you talk to conflict-weary people, most of whom are the people that we said deep down there, you know, when we talk of government actors, they normally, what comes on top of their head is the local authority. Yeah, then of course, the second line could be at state level, then the national level. And they know, the people know very well that these people are well connected politically, you know, because even the government actors at local level, they are also political appointees, as it were. So what comes into their mind, how they associate their challenges with these actors, they look at the frontliners, who are the local actors. Then if you also look at how the government in South Sudan is seen as benefiting from the conflict, you know, there's a general perception really from the people that they are political entrepreneurs particularly the government who are perpetuating the crisis, you know, to their own benefit. Mafias in terms of cattle, yeah, because if you look at the magnitude and the extent of cattle raiding at times, you see some connections, political connections between the frontliners and those who are in Juba, in the city and the bigger cities. So they seem to people know and they see that. Then also, when you also look at particularly some of the politically motivated violence that has been ongoing, people really know that now, you know, they will be targeting specific groups. Like, for example, in the areas where we're working, part of the area was, controlled by the, opposition. They call it opposition. The other one was government. So the opposition controlled, the economic hub, including the ports along Nile River in that state. So the government had to crack the whip and they had to displace and dislodge the IOM, the opposition, because they wanted access to the economic hub. Yeah, and the people really know exactly who benefits in terms of because the benefits do not really accrue to the people. People don't see and they don't feel the benefits. There are no roads. There's no safe delivery. The government system is essentially weak. There's nothing that comes out of the state, but they know that this is an economic hub, as it were. So so I think yes, people also, like I've alluded to, they know the source of the influence, particularly when it comes to vertical influence, to say, yes, this is happening, yes, this hate speech is there, but they know that there are certain entrepreneurs sitting elsewhere, drinking cup and coffee elsewhere, who are part and parcel of this, confusion. Yeah. So at times, because of the nature of the context, people are not free to talk about that. But when we had this this research, really, it was good because it was an event. Because the governance diary, it was like we had iterative discussions with the 20 people for 3-4 months, and so forth. So they ended up giving out that information slowly, but it's not information that can come out easily from the people. The people know, but they are mute. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eddie. That was great. And I just want to step in and say, just reflecting on all 4 presentations, I'm just really struck by the deep understanding of these local contexts that everyone presented. And the other thing is reflecting on, and I think Katya's question sort of got at this that you just reflected on, Eddie, is just the range of actors engaged. And Imrana, when you were speaking, I was really struck by how that initial effort to find peace by paying for protection was really an effort to avoid violent conflict, right? But ultimately, that payment ended up fueling the militias and fueling violent conflict. So, you know, just an example of somehow of a case where these really good attempts at conflict avoidance can lead in another direction. And I'd love to follow up with you on that. And Achim, I think, you know, your points about how it really is these informal groups that we need to be able to work with. I am really struck by your presentation and your challenge to traditional development actors to say, like, look, we need to be working in different ways, and what does that look like, and what are the lessons from the peace building world about working across various actors, including opposition actors, to really do things like advancing climate action. So I have heard you loud and clear on that. I'm trying to get to a question. I have a whole series of questions that I've written down in response to everybody's presentations, but given our limited time, I think I would just make one more comment, sort of reflecting on Achim's presentation, which is we've also really seen climate adaptation as being a tool for peace building. And you, Achim, you really presented how peace building is a tool for adaptation. And I am so happy to just like gain that insight. But then just, you know, I think that it can really work both ways. And it makes me just see a much more powerful connection between peace building and climate adaptation, because as we see climate risk impacting all of the actors involved, that can be a really compelling reason for groups to come together in new ways, or work together in new ways. Maybe I should just stop there and see if you want to respond to any of that quickly, recognizing that I know we're short on time.
Thank you, Laurie. Just very briefly. Indeed, the climate change as a connector for the various groups coming together is indeed something that that many actors working on peace mediation, at least in this town, are very much developing. For the project with USIP, it would have been another paper. So we acknowledged it, and it's a very important line of work. With respect to the challenge of traditional development done in an institutional form, again, from a Geneva or a Swiss perspective, this type of working is just called private diplomacy. You have many private diplomacy actors. In the US, the Carter Center is one, this is a global connected group of private diplomacy actors that have access to everyone. If you want to understand how the grain deal started, it came out of private diplomacy engagements. This is, of course, the grain deal on Ukraine, which harkens back to another notion we published out in a publication which is called the Geneva Policy Outlook. The concept is called Earth diplomacy, which is essentially private diplomacy in the service of problem solving, the private diplomacy way, in order to accelerate adaptation to climate change. And that you Google Earth diplomacy, Geneva Policy Outlook, you will find it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And Katya, I just want to note that I was so impressed with the work that you'd done, and so intrigued by how host and displaced communities were finding ways of working together and actually avoiding some of the conflict that we've seen play out in other areas. And so we're just going to have to follow up separately on what sort of is at play there that's really leading to this example where, despite an inadequacy of government, there really is sort of some peaceful processes in place and a lack of conflict in a place where we might expect to see it. I am so sorry that we are at time already. I just want to give a huge thanks to everyone for these really compelling presentations. about really complex situations. And again, I appreciate so much the insights that you all have led us to through the conversation today. Thank you so much. I really look forward to following all of your work and would love to follow up with any of you individually as well. Thank you, Jesse, for taking us through the conversation in such a wonderful way. And thanks to IRC for hosting us.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you all. Bye.